Welcome, everybody. This is Tony UcedaVélez. I'm here to talk about an exciting topic, which is how to introduce a threat model as a blueprint for both security offense and defense. So this is a presentation where both red teamers and blue teamers can hopefully take some takeaways from in order to build better security response measures, better attack measures when you're attacking a scoped out environment. A little bit about myself. I am a chapter leader for OWASP in the Atlanta region in the United States. I'm also the author of risk-centric threat modeling, which is a threat modeling methodology that me and a co-author, Marco Marana from the UK, was basically helped to develop this methodology, which is risk-focused. And we published a book together with 2015 with Wiley Life Sciences. It is a risk-centric threat modeling methodology that we'll actually cover in today's presentation. Basically, really a big threat modeling evangelist, and I've had a lot of great, interesting conversations with multinational companies in my travels and leading the Versprite company, which is a global security consulting firm. So a lot of my thoughts and sharings of today in terms of lessons learned and approaches really comes from 23 years of industry experience in IT, NIS, and also 13 years of running a global security consulting firm with my broad team. So let's just dive right in. The first area that we're really going to look into is first trying to level set on some misinterpretations and how to properly consider threat into both a red team capacity as well as a blue team capacity. Now, obviously, from a red team standpoint, our goal as a red teamer is to attack, right? We want to be able to collect trophies as part of an engagement. We want to be able to, establish persistence in a client network environment. Obviously, be able to demonstrate how you can pilfer data stores, databases, applications, whatever is in scope for testing. And traditionally, red teamers have this mindset that is basically triggered from what they're targeting in the environment. So if you're targeting an organization as a red team, or if you're doing a pen test of an application, usually what you're pen testing or what you're red teaming dictates a lot of what you do in terms of your approach and methodology. And sure, there's a lot of great methodologies and approaches that are out there. Beginning with the CREST organization having a methodology and approach that really looks at the best of breed in terms of steps for open source intelligence gathering all the way to exploitation and post-exploitation. But what we want to do here is begin with a threat model. And why do we want to do that? Well, oftentimes when you're attacking an organization as a white hat, you want to be able to really emulate true adversaries, right? And sometimes that's not done as well when you're just basically looking at the environment and the target asset is basically dictating what you do next. So you might run into an Apache web server and say, oh, let me try some Apache, types of exploits based upon some vulnerabilities I'm seeing. So the whole exercise really becomes, just focused around the types of components that you have in scope. Now, the difference with using a threat model is first you take a step back. Threat modeling is really meant to build better red teaming and blue teams in the sense that it adds context to realistic attack objectives, which true cyber criminals want to achieve. A key misunderstanding in the white hat infosec cybersecurity professional space is that oftentimes vulnerabilities automatically implies a threat, and that's not necessarily true. So when oftentimes red teamers or people that are doing pen tests, obviously, one of the first things that they'll do as part of their process, or second or tertiary things that they'll do actually, is to be able to identify what vulnerabilities are in their environment. And that to them may imply, oh, this is a threat. The presence of a vulnerability automatically equates to a threat, and that's far from the case. So it's important to understand what is a threat in the English, in the English language. And a threat is a possibility of a menace of occurring with a specific motive and objective. And a vulnerability is simply a means to which that threat could realize with an attack. So I just mentioned those three words there that oftentimes get sometimes misconstrued in, when doing adversarial exercises. Now, it's important that red teamers, beyond understanding that, let's introduce this threat notion into our red teaming activities. They also need to understand what the attack surface is. But not just simply from attack surface when you're doing a red team, oftentimes might translate to scope. And that's not, how a true cyber criminal will look at it. They'll define the attack surface based upon overall intent. They'll look at infrastructure, they'll look at people, they'll look at process, they'll look at supply chain vendors, and all of these things equate to a means to an end where the end may be a threat motive. It's also important that, there's a level of organization as you begin with this parent hierarchy that begins with a threat node and affects components, that you map out vulnerabilities that align to those components, and then you identify which exploits could actually best affect those vulnerabilities. We're going to introduce something called an attack tree a little bit later on, and we're actually going to see that attack tree exemplified in the energy sector as a way to basically demonstrate how this could all be organized. So there's a lot of benefits of using a threat model to organize red teaming, some of which is that you can also build attack and threat libraries, because oftentimes, white hats have really a difficult time of truly emulating criminal intent. And so it's important that, a true threat library based upon current threat patterns, threat motives, current adversarial groups gets depicted in a threat library, and similarly so for an attack library. Now, the great thing about threat models is that it's looking at the full stack of what could be attacked. True criminals oftentimes will look at people, process, technology, and within technology you have network, you have infrastructure, you have cloud, you have mobile client, you have the full gamut of things that are at their disposal and interest to target. Similarly, red teamers should kind of think of it the same way. Oftentimes when we do pen testing, right or wrong with whoever we're doing pen testing with, whether you're doing internal pen testing or you're a firm doing pen testing for someone else, you can get scoped into a box that doesn't truly emulate what a cyber criminal may actually do. Now let's flip this and look at it from a defensive standpoint. So where does a threat model really come in? So oftentimes when you're in a security operations center, you have eyes on glass, as the term is said, where you're looking at alerts come in every minute, and those alerts are coming in from firewalls and IDSs and IPSs and host-based agents. So there's numerous different alerts that are coming in, from the infrastructure. Which alerts do you focus on the most? So the threat model builds context based upon threat data that you harvest from within your infrastructure, as well as threat intelligence. So it's important that as blue teamers or those that are involved in security operations, substantiate the threats. Understand what are the threats that you're responding to in terms of those events, in terms of those alerts for your security incident event monitoring solutions. It's also important to correlate threat intel from the outside to see how that intelligence is talking about current and recent incidents, observable incidents that have basically affected other companies within your industry, within your sub-industry. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. So, the big point here is context on both. Oftentimes when you're in the SOC, you can't substantiate that the alerts that you're triaging are actually supporting threat patterns that actually exist. Because oftentimes the alerts that we get within our respective security operations are triggered by tools, and these tools are largely signature based, and these signatures were developed, well intended, by oftentimes researchers within those product companies, but the point in time in which the signatures were introduced is a long, long, long time ago compared to what are some of the current threats and trends that are happening today. And so, the big example I like to provide is, how do you know that even like reconnaissance type traffic or maybe access control violations isn't actually something that relates to a broader threat pattern, a broader threat motive? If we're just looking at alerts that pop up in our respective tool set, then we might be caught flat-footed and lose that context that we need in order to recognize a true threat versus simply an alert. Okay, so let's talk about, again, some additional terms that are oftentimes misconstrued, especially when we're storming the castle or defending the castle, which really applies to both the red team aspect and the blue team aspect. So, threat modeling, there's right now, threat modeling is hot. It's a hot topic, a lot of people talking about it, but oftentimes they bypass one of the main intents of threat modeling, and that is to model your threats. Do you understand, as a adversarial person emulating adversarial tendencies, or someone defending the castle, do you understand what the threats are? What's at stake? And so it's important to understand what is threat modeling, also to understand what is the attack surface that you're truly defending. So let's talk on the second bullet point here. Let me just focus on the blue team for a second. So again, stemming from a lot of my experience, both within the private and public sector, as well as consulting over a decade, I've seen that a lot of companies, oftentimes as part of a security program best practices, quote unquote, they buy what I call Noah's Ark security. 2 of every tool set that's out there. They implement it, install it, they get alerts, there's metrics, there's dashboards, and then they're feeling that there's some level of coverage that's actually happening. There might be, but I would say that it's more coincidence than anything else, because they're not really thinking about how all those alerts that are tripping on endpoint alerts or infrastructure alerts or application related alerts truly correlates to threats that are specific to their industry. And what we're going to look at a little bit later on is we're going to focus on the energy sector and kind of to see how we can exemplify the benefit of threat modeling as compared to just simply not having a threat model and just simply going about instantiating a security operations process or attack patterns against the energy sector without a threat model. And clearly there'll be some differences that hopefully will be appreciated. So the attack surface, in simple terms, can define the scope for penetration tests. They can also define the scope or areas what you want to log. Determining what you want to log, I don't think it would be irrational to basically ask, would you like a solution provider with your technology set to determine what you would like to log as it relates to you in the healthcare sector or in the gaming, sector, or what about hospitality industry or, fintech area? Obviously, what you want to log, there's some general things like, violations in access control, I think, are important across the board, but there's some things that are going to be specific for certain types of industries where data is the most important thing, continuity of business is the most important thing, or the integrity of the data is the most important thing. So the threat model puts all those things into context, and you can substantiate a lot of those things with the threat intelligence that you pull in from the outside, but as well as threat data that you pull from your infrastructure to let you know what is actually going on, what's alerting today, and what are signs that there's actually threats that correlate to my threat model. Now, I talked about this methodology in the beginning, where me and my co-author basically developed this risk-centric threat modeling methodology. It's actually called PASTA. And if you Google threat modeling and PASTA, you're going to basically get a lot of hits of this risk-centric threat modeling methodology. But in a nutshell, it's a 7-phase process. Each phase has different activities. And you can take this methodology and make it 5, make it 4 stages. You can take the best out of it and suit it to how you need it based upon your organization, your amount of resources, et cetera. But the process for attack simulation and threat analysis, which is what PASTA really stands for, was really built on the fact that we need to look at security from more of an adversarial lens. We need to get into the mindset of the true cyber criminal and try to understand intent so we can define possible attack patterns. And so, just quickly running down, where can this benefit red and blue teams? There's, the fact that unlike other threat modeling methodologies, it looks at the full stack. And when we say that in IT or in the technology sense, it means, when you speak of the full stack, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean, the full stack of your architecture, right, of what you're going to be attacking or defending. The presentation layer, the business logic application layer, and then the backend data layer. It could also mean the full stack of infrastructure that supports systems, that supports applications, that supports data. So, all of these different layers, if you will, really need a thorough understanding. It could have unique attack patterns against them, right? So we need a methodology that encompasses the full stack. And just really quickly, the first three stages of the process for attack simulation and threat analysis really are meant to define the context of importance around what's in scope. So, as an example, an oil production company, their main thing is research, the confidentiality of research of what they find in terms of new places to drill, as an example, as well as continuity. They want to make sure that well spots are operational. They're pumping millions and billions of barrels of crude oil, as much as possible in order to make money, obviously. So establishing that context is really important. And if you think about it from a defensive side, that makes it more contextual to what you really need to keep your eyes open for, where you need to calibrate all your alerts, where you need to kind of focus more. On the adversarial side, it adds some context where do you want to focus in more in order to create the biggest pain? Maybe you want to do extortion. Maybe in order to do extortion, if you try to have an extortion plan, through, let's say, a ransomware attack, and if you don't basically apply it to the right type of infrastructure or servers, then as a cyber criminal, you're going to be wasting your time. And so you really want, from emulating a cyber exercises and through a red team, you really want to focus on what are the things that are going to cause the biggest impact. And again, this is identified usually in the first stage. The second stage defines the scope of your attack surface. The third stage allows for us to understand how does it all work together, right? You can't defend or even attack what you don't understand, because otherwise you're just shooting blind. And then the other phases, really between the fourth, fifth, and sixth phase, are really more adversarial, right? And then even from a blue team perspective, like, you want to understand what types of threats you have to correlate into your overall program, into what you're configuring for logging and alerting. You want to understand how the presence of vulnerabilities within your environment actually facilitates the likelihood that threats can actually happen. And then the attack phase is simply the smoking gun. I call it the smoking gun because oftentimes when you're trying to, everyone who's a security professional recognizes that remediation is not an easy process, right? Oftentimes we have to sell remediation within our respective enterprises and companies and private sectors, public sectors as well, where you're having to kind of almost convince certain team members to remediate things. Well, if you can demonstrate that an attack is viable based upon the presence of a vulnerability, and it basically can realize a threat objective or threat motive that is current with trends that are supported by threat intel, it would be reckless for anyone that owns that information or owns that infrastructure to turn a blind eye. Now, at the end, the reason that PASTA, or the process for attack simulation and threat analysis, is called a risk-centric approach, because everything is about contextualizing both the importance of what we're trying to defend or attack, as well, as in terms of how the importance of what we're willing to remediate or develop countermeasures for. I'm not going to go into that much more detail. I just simply wanted to share this maturity model. I did talk about how, if you've never done threat modeling and you just want to be able to try it out and maybe, understand a little bit more about PASTA as an example, there's some suggestive, very simplistic, maturity steps that you can take. And just really quickly is, from a defensive side, that's what I call a blind threat model. And step one of PASTA, says, listen, I align to multiple frameworks that, are best practices, maybe ISO, maybe some hardening guides from my cloud service provider, CIS benchmarks. I mean, there's obviously a ton of different things that you can align your infrastructure hardening, system hardening, cloud best practices, et cetera. So in doing that, you can basically establish what I call a blind threat model. From the very beginning, once you're trying to understand the attack surface and define the objectives of what you're trying to defend, you can then correlate the type of assets that you have with the type of best practices that exist for those assets. And when I say assets, that's again across the full stack. Application, system, network, et cetera. Now, this middle step here is really, geared for both red teamers and, blue teamers. So, let's talk about the red teaming for a second. So you're going to pen test an environment. You're going to red team a company. Well, why not take evidence of what types of adversarial, maybe some incidents that have affected that industry in the past 24 months that you can try to emulate? Because what happens in the real world is that oftentimes when there's successful cyber criminals, they share a lot of their means and ways in which they did things. The tools that were used, the payloads that were used, the malware that was used, the attack vectors that were used, these techniques don't stand in isolation. They basically are shared, and there's a lot of hiring and subcontracting, if you will, of some of these different, adversarial groups that are, out to fulfill an objective. So as a red teamer, why wouldn't you try to emulate what are some realistic, attack patterns or threats, motives that, real cyber criminals are doing? Again, similar type infrastructure, similar type applications, or similar type, companies. Now, evolving more to a full risk-based threat model, this is where you do a lot more analytics. There's a lot of different, the future in security is definitely going to be in automation. There's a lot of major players, everyone from VMware to some of the new startup companies within the industry that are looking to have more sophisticated automation that is backed by artificial intelligence or machine learning. So there's a couple different companies that are out there, for example, where they're going to run a lot of different automatic, pen tests against, a target, let's say API, or against a target listener or a daemon or service that's running. And, the purpose of automation is to, in the context of threat modeling, to be honest, is to look at the probability coefficient for risk. So in a risk-centric approach, you really want to demonstrate that this attack pattern, this type of attack is completely viable, because then you can present irrefutable evidence to your client, to the system owner, to the infrastructure owner, the CTO, whomever your audience is, to say, we did a battery of tests, this worked 100% of the time, 80% of the time. And there's multiple different companies that exist that have that technology to do that. But the main point I'm trying to say here is that you can use metrics to demonstrate the probability increases with certain types of testing. Now, you can still do this manually, and you can still, test. Let's say that you want to test the likelihood of injection-based attacks, and you throw, 500 different types of payloads against, API endpoints, and you see that, you have a high success rate. When it comes to injection-based attacks, maybe some of those injection-based attacks allow you to take data out, which correlates to confidentiality loss, which should correlate to, defining what is impactful in the PASTA threat model. So as you can see, we're slowly trying to connect the dots. And that's really what the risk-centric approach to threat modeling is all about. It's connecting the dots with context for both a red team and blue team context. Okay, so what should your objectives be when you're trying to build your threat model, and what are some things that you can do in the early stages of threat modeling? Well, one is, we want to substantiate your activities as a red teamer or as a blue teamer. Right now, individually, the substantiation of what we do as a blue team, for example, oftentimes, from my experience, comes from largely tool-led enterprises. they have the means to buy multiple different tools. They read that there's certain obviously non-negotiable types of logs that are important. I mentioned a couple of them before, like access control violations. I think is pretty much a non-negotiable. It's always something that you want to look at. But there might be other types of alerts that are really tuned to your threat landscape, to your industry, right? And I mentioned a couple different sectors before. So you want to substantiate your defensive mode of what you're looking at and contextualize those alerts to say, does this alert or event fall within my threat model? And where does it fall into? Does it fall into the attack surface of my infrastructure, my systems, my cloud environment, et cetera? So it just provides a realistic consideration as to how do you tie threats into your actual scope of assets that you're analyzing. So in substantiating your threat model, one thing that you can do is to build your threat library. And a threat library is really simple to do. Oftentimes, when you hear the word library, you're thinking about an exhaustive list of things that you need to enumerate. But we'll go through an example threat library shortly on where you can see how the library can help to be a centerpiece for how you attack and how you defend. But in order to get there, you really have to research threat data, threat intelligence reports, analyze the data, correlate it to the most relevant attack patterns that again support those threats, and also correlate it to your environment, and then incorporate it into your pen testing regimen. When you define the threats and the attack surface and what you're after, if you're trying to basically demonstrate that you can attack an environment and use it to introduce malware through file upload use cases within an application environment, and continuity is king for that environment, then you can basically support it from the threat intel that you have against an industry all the way down to the vulnerability and to the attack patterns. Now, let's take a look about that case study. I referenced it many times early on, and in this second phase, we're going to look at a oil and gas company based in the Nordic region. So let's just think about the industry before the cyberspace, if you will. Traditional threats that affect oil and gas from a physical nature are all of those things that are listed in bullet points there. You can have internal sabotage, organized crime may want to attack it for different reasons. Maybe they're hired hacker syndicates or disruptors. There might be insurgency or terrorism. So there's a whole list of inherent threats. And then now you add on the cyber layer where you have interconnected platforms and web-enabled interfaces to sophisticated devices that are on oil rigs or well spots. Then you were actually amplifying the threat landscape. So here's some cyber-related threats that we can begin to incorporate into a threat library. And this is basically again focused on the kind of oil and gas. Tainting data is maybe a threat motive by a competitive or a corporate sanction attack. You might have obviously natural resources is a scarce commodity. There is a lot of competition for exploration, rights to different areas on the planet, whether it be international waters or land. But obviously gaining information about where ripe natural resources locations are is important for all the players that are in that space. And then once you're actually tapping into the resources and collecting metrics on the quality or the amount being mined, et cetera, that's data that basically helps operational team members to make decisions, right? And so if they're making decisions on information, a threat motive might be to taint that information so that they can basically get disrupted. And then by the time that they figure out that their data has been tainted, they've actually either poorly utilized some of their infrastructure to maximize their exploration or whatever they're actually doing. Extortion is a key one. We'll talk about that in a second with actually a real case scenario that actually happened. But continuity is very important in this business. And so when you basically interrupt the availability or the flow of the supply chain, if you will, or even the research data that helps to determine yay or nay on different types of exploration activities, then you're actually shaping up a ripe threat motive for an adversarial group. So from a pen testing standpoint, how do you emulate that, right? From a blue team standpoint, what types of events and infrastructure, again, going back to your attack surface, what types of events do you want to look at that says, hey, this could actually relate to some level of extortion, based upon some pre-attack level recon, maybe some open source intelligence gathering, some fingerprinting done against the infrastructure, maybe some types of invasive techniques to upload malicious malware, through some of the ransomwares or some of the key attack vectors or payloads, if you will, that are used for those types of threat motives. Mining cryptocurrency, so there's, the thing about the oil and gas, infrastructure is that their IT footprint in terms of resources, I mean, they need sophisticated infrastructure, but there may not be, as big of an IT presence in terms of humans that, compared to, for example, the financial sector, right? So, if you want to do crypto jacking, or if you want to leverage infrastructure, from someone else, then you go to industries where that there's not a lot of people watching, right? You want to go to powerful infrastructures where that they may not have the most sophisticated means to detect rogue technology, rogue software. Maybe you have if you're able to introduce, multiple different crypto software clients that do mining across, for example, a pretty robust cloud platform, that's great for you because you're passively collecting money and you're able to, mine some cryptocurrency in the process. The other threat here is stealing secrets. Obviously, it goes without saying that exploration and research and development is super proprietary, so maintaining the secrecy of that information is really important. Okay, so let's talk about an actual. So this threat library. Let's take a look at this this company in the Nordic region. What they basically had is they migrated. They've been migrating a lot to the cloud, and the cloud introduces its own set of inherent threats and attack patterns. But add to that the support of cloud infrastructure, cloud applications. In this case, it was through a third-party supply vendor that basically provided a lot of the cloud, a cloud solution for managing well spots. So this is a cloud-based multi-tenant application that basically allowed for this particular Nordic oil company to focus in on wellhead operations. So, one of the threat motives here from an adversarial standpoint, let's say we're pen testing this application. And again, this application is really part of a third party. What we want to do is if we're going to basically pick one item from our threat library, let's say we want to do extortion, what aspect of, the wellhead operations can actually be affected where we can introduce some level of malware all the way down to the wellhead, where there might be some interface between the cloud, a web API, all the way down to a kind of industrial control system or a device that is web enabled, right? So you have a web enabled device that's physically sitting at the well spot. What sort of injection based attack can you do where you can actually break the system? You can actually, encrypt the system and hold it for ransom and do that, across all the different well spots that are managed by this wellhead application. So that, as an example, would be a great abuse case from a pen testing standpoint. Another one, from a defensive standpoint might be, if you flip that one, is to see what sort of use cases within the application do support, let's say, file uploads. So what we're seeing here is on the right side is that once you get to, there's a couple different use cases that this particular application supports. And if one of them might be, the ability to upload files, and let's say that the application doesn't really do a good job of inspecting those types of files, and that you can perpetrate a legitimate file with a illegitimate file that's actually, malware related, then there could be an opportunity for some level of remote code execution of that malware on that particular device that's actually at the wellhead. So, ironically, when I did this presentation, when I first developed it, it was some time ago, and coincidentally, in recent news events, this particular oil conglomerate was actually extorted recently as they were the victims of ransomware. So, when you're building a threat library, I had initially, the one major step there was doing the research, right? You obviously have to understand a lot of what are the likely criminal intents and threat motives from the cyber criminal's perspective. And that's going to allow you to defend better. It's going to allow you to attack much better. Something that I like to do when we basically do engagements, whether it be organizational threat models or application threat models, or even like building a framework for security operation groups to defend against, is that we establish kind of a threat modeling card. And what this does is summarizes the library that's at stake against, with the motives that are, substantiated by threat intel. It correlates that to the attack surface at a broad level for the organization and the specific attack patterns. Now, these specific attack patterns, you could leverage within as a security operations center team member to say what types of logs and alerts would actually correlate to these types of attack patterns. So just looking at this very, very simple list, you might see that, well, how can I get email-based alerts that relates to spear phishing? Maybe I want to look at that. What types of, application alerts can alert me on file uploads that fall outside the norm, fall outside of maybe my whitelist of acceptable parameters? So those are just two very simple examples where you, as a blue teamer, you can actually start to hone in on things that correlate to attack patterns that are going to target your industry. In this specific case, coincidentally, this particular company was actually affected by ransomware, and it cost them some downtime. And if you want to unitize what downtime is in the oil sector, it's not any small number to laugh at. But this is a great type of summary card that you can build, and you can correlate what types of threats actually are going to be correlated to your attack patterns. And then something that I also like to do in addition is to see what types of countermeasures or controls does my client, the scope of the application actually support today, so I can look at the residual risk of at a very, very high level of what types of controls exist to mitigate some of these different types of attacks. And obviously, I want to be able to tap into those controls and see what sort of events and logs they trigger from a blue team perspective. Okay, I didn't mean to skip over this slide. This is a very important slide, especially for all my red teamers out there. So attack trees is something that allows us to organize and really kind of blueprint our attack patterns. We basically begin with defining a threat from our threat library. So that's the box in red. We then decide, okay, what types of attacks, and now I'm going back to the vernacular, because oftentimes people use in security threats and attacks synonymously, and they're not. Threat is a possibility. Attack is actually an exercise pattern that takes place, and usually in support of a broader objective, like a threat motive. So we're looking at it, this threat of like, I want to sabotage, alarm data. There's a use case in the well spot operations that relates to flaring alarm data. So maybe you want to disable it, maybe you want to subjugate it, but you basically, in premise, you establish a threat, and then that parent node is going to have underlying attacks. Now that underlying attacks, you can use a threat library like KPEC is a great threat library, and you can kind of see what types of attack patterns correlate to vulnerabilities that would realize a successful attack. And then so those vulnerabilities, you could use CVEs if they're related to systems and infrastructure. Maybe you actually have vulnerabilities that there's none that have been defined, and maybe you can basically employ the use of someone to develop the viability of a 0-day to see if there truly is a possibility of a vulnerability to allow for rogue sensor parts to be implemented into the well spot in this example. But you go from there, and sometimes you can also, like we looked at a web application that was in the cloud, you might actually leverage CWE for weaknesses. So the point here is that we map a threat to an attack to what's wrong, which is the vulnerability or weakness. We correlate that to the component, that's in use, otherwise known to be a component within our attack surface. So the ones that are denoted with black boxes are areas of scope that we want to attack, maybe as part of our pen test. And so in all, the attack tree provides an excellent visual blueprint for a red teamer to conduct an adversarial exercise to test the viability of all those different branches, and it completely accentuates the report, because now you're establishing credence at the very top with the threat objective, with the threat motive, with the threat that is supported by threat intel from the industry of your client or your own particular company that you might be pen testing for. So I can't really advocate this enough. I think it's a great way to really kind of change the game of how we do red team and blue teaming. But let me close with this last section of the presentation where we really look at some industry perspective and adversarial tendencies that we can kind of leverage as part of threat modeling, building a threat library, and also looking at better ways for focusing some security monitoring. So speaking of monitoring, as a former SOC analyst myself, where you're trapped in the dungeon, your eyes on glass, you're working first, second, third shift. Hopefully not, all together, but you're spending a lot of time looking at alerts day after day after day after day, and so anyone that's out there that is in that role or has been in that role basically can relate and probably has some level of traumatic scarring from looking at all those alerts. But here we see where most of that scarring, kind of playfully just depicting that, where you have, sometimes up to 1 million alerts that come in. And, in the early days where there wasn't a correlation engine that would correlate a lot of things for security engineers, they were looking at raw events. And this would just obviously desensitize the security analysts. Where we are today is that, there's a lot of basic rules and advanced rules that are doing some correlation. There's some pattern detection. There's some basic, filtering and aggregation so that you're not seeing, 1,000 alerts uniquely. They're maybe correlated to one type. And that's all well and good. But in the end, we still have some opportunity to even create a wrapper, if you will, where it's a threat model that it's a threat. It's based upon threat context, right? So you build a threat model, you build a threat library. And for the threat library, we basically define what are the attacks, what are the vulnerabilities that support the viability of this threat. And so this allows you to basically get to the tighter end of the funnel, where you're really looking at events that makes the most impact, and basically that really can save the company. So you want to use the human intellectual capital when it's not desensitized, and you want to have his or her focus be on the alerts that actually matter. So this is where a risk-centric threat modeling approach comes in, like CASA, where you can get there. Now, building a future threat library really requires input from a lot of different, talented people. What's important for an organization, whether you're, a security analyst and you're doing it for an organization, you want to understand what the context is of importance from the people that run the company. One of the things that I always tell all of our team members at Versprite is, do you understand how your client makes money? That's the first question you got to know as a security professional, whether you're on a blue team or a red team. And to understand that business, impact of what you're attacking or what you're defending it really anchors how you're going to message your findings later on. Obviously, you got to be able to think like a hacker, and thinking like a hacker sounds easy. There's a lot of stereotypes of what a hacker looks like, how a hacker acts. The best hacker is the one that basically doesn't fall into the stereotype, right? You want to be, it's more about the mindset. How do you bypass? How do you defeat? How do you elude? How do you evade? How do you subjugate? How do you, how do you basically achieve your objective, which might be hacktivism, which might be corporate IP theft, which might be, personal data, theft. How do you achieve those objectives with the attack patterns to the components within the attack surface that you're defining? That's really important. Sound technologists. So you can't, if you don't understand the technology, then you probably won't hack it very well. You also probably, won't understand it very well if you're from an alerting side. But I would think that the technology awareness and understanding probably affects the red teamer more than the blue teamer, but not by much. And so it's important to understand how the technologies work, because in understanding the use cases and design, that's where you as a hacker can understand how to develop abuse cases and ways to defeat the design pattern that's in place. Now, I will leave, this is a phenomenal schema that was developed initially by some projects led from MITRE and was taken over by Oasis. But the Stix framework is a security framework for threat intelligence sharing and exchange. And it basically has many constructs. It has 9 different constructs. And a lot of the constructs, center around information that alone are super important. Let's just take, the top one there called indicator. So indicators of compromise within the framework of Stix has multiple different, let's say, data elements that you can populate. And today in the industry, there are multiple different players that are sharing threat intel where they have this construct populated and they're sharing it. A lot of the ISACs, like the SSISAC and other types of ISACs that are out there, or CERT agencies, computer emergency response teams, are employing the use of services and tools where a lot of threat information is being shared. So from a red teamer and blue teamer perspective, there is a taxonomy, there is a framework where, your related activities for attacking could fall into, populating some of the information within here. So from a blue team perspective, let's say that you want to consume threat intel that shows indicators of compromise within your sub-industry or industry. And so that's important for you because that provides threat intelligence that might be relatable to threat motives that are affecting you within your particular sector. And that's really important. As from a pen testing standpoint, there might be, the main area there is that horse chess piece, purple item there is TTP, for tools, tactics, and procedures, where you're going to have different types of patterns that are going to facilitate attack against a target component, a target infrastructure, a target aspect within your overall attack surface. So the great thing about this framework is that there's intermappings. So the more information you collect of indicators of compromise are actually incidents that took place, another construct within the Stix framework that can allow you to, that can be extremely useful. Obviously, you want to know incidents that took place within your respective industry. All those things are good intel that you can share. And we need to be able to leverage more of the tools and companies that are actually committing to leveraging this framework, because it's extremely well thought out, and there's ways in which you can actually map some of the different constructs to things like CVEs for vulnerabilities, things like CAPEX for attack patterns, or even the new attack post-exploitation framework. So there's great opportunity here and interoperability that can serve both red teamers and blue teamers. So last but not least, every sector has great information for contextualizing threats. If you're walking away from this presentation and you're like, you know what, let me take a stab at building a threat library, that's awesome, because that's the first step in really establishing a good threat model, specifically within a risk-centric approach. So oftentimes when you're within a different sector, you can go to different ISACs that support your sector. I have kind of like my just personal grades in terms of what I think some of the intel is. Some of these sectors, some of these intel sharing resources are still maturing. Some other of them are great. Twitter is a great source of intel. You might be able to find, for example, things that are on, Twitter that might relate to, or other types of social media platforms that relate to observables, one of the constructs in the Stix framework as an example. But I encourage everyone to start to research something specific to your respective industry or sub-industry, and specific also to your attack surface that you're trying to defend or attack, so that you can emulate and build a better plan for a red teaming engagement or a better framework for incident and event monitoring and response. So if you want to ask me some questions, or you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm T0NYUV, or you can follow me on LinkedIn as well. Email is there on the slide. And if you have some additional questions, there is actually more information on the process for attack simulation and threat analysis on the Versprite.com website. Thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you all.